Blood trailing in the red dust was supposed to be his end. Pushed to the edge of a dying world, a lone engineer faced an empire of apex predators. They laughed, calling him fragile prey. They didn't realize they had just awoken a monster, and hunting season had begun. Elias Stanton was not a soldier. He was a baseline Earth-born engineer, a man who had spent 42 years keeping his head down, paying his union dues, and breathing the recycled air of a dozen different deep space mining colonies. On the irradiated, storm-battered surface of Aegis Prime, Elias was nothing more than a ghost in a hazard suit. He ran a solitary isotopic separator in Sector 4, squeezing trace amounts of hyperlithium out of the planet's crust. It was dirty, back-breaking work, but it paid enough to keep his oxygen tanks full and his corporate debt slowly ticking downward. Aegis Prime was ruled by the Centauri Syndicate, a coalition of high G-born colonists and genetically spliced brutes who viewed baseline humans as little more than soft, fragile meat. The Syndicate overseers stood nearly 7 feet tall, their bone density tripled by gravity treatments. Their skin thickened to withstand the harsh UV radiation of a binary star system. To them, humanity was an evolutionary dead end, a weak species good only for crawling into the narrow mining shafts their own hulking frames couldn't fit into. Overseer Smith was the worst of them. Smith was a massive slab of muscle and arrogance, a regional boss who demanded a 30% cut of every independent miner's yield. For 3 years, Elias had paid the extortion fee without a word of complaint. He had smiled, handed over the encrypted credit chips, and gone back to his dirt. Elias believed in survival through invisibility. He believed that if you didn't cast a shadow, no one would shoot at it. That philosophy died on a Tuesday. Elias had hit a motherlode, a compressed vein of pure hyperlithium that would have cleared his corporate debt entirely and bought him a first-class shuttle ticket back to the core worlds. He was in the middle of securing the extraction canisters when the heavy, thudding footsteps of Syndicate boots vibrated through the metal grating of his platform. Smith didn't come alone. He brought 3 enforcers, including his right-hand man, Briggs, a brute whose jaw was entirely replaced with a cybernetic steel mandate. "Stanton," Smith's voice boomed, carrying over the hum of the atmospheric processors. He didn't wear a helmet. His thick, gray-tinted skin easily resisted the toxic smog. "You've been busy. My scanners picked up a high-yield thermal spike from your sector. Looks like you struck the big one." Elias stood up slowly, wiping grease from his hands with a stained rag. He kept his posture submissive, his voice steady. "Just a lucky pocket, Overseer. I've already calculated your 30%. It's boxed and ready on the loading pallet." Smith chuckled, a wet, grating sound. He stepped onto the platform, his massive boots denting the steel mesh. He walked past the designated 30% and kicked the entire extraction crate open. The raw, glowing, blue lithium spilled out, illuminating the grim faces of the enforcers. "There's a new tax policy in effect, Stanton," Smith said, turning back to the human. "As of today, Sector 4 is Syndicate property. All yields are confiscated. You're being evicted." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just extortion. This was a death sentence. Without his claim, he would default on his life support lease within 48 hours. "Smith, please. That's my ticket out. You take that. I have nothing. I can't buy oxygen. I can't even buy a shuttle off this rock." "Sounds like a baseline problem," Briggs sneered, stepping forward. Elias did something he hadn't done in a decade. He stood his ground. He took a step toward the crate, placing his body between the lithium and the Syndicate boss. "I mind this. It's registered under the Core World Labor Treaty. You can't just take it all." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the howling wind outside the rig. Smith's eyes narrowed. In his world, baselines didn't talk back. They didn't stand up. They bled, they cried, and they obeyed. Smith didn't even use a weapon. He just swung his massive, dense fist. The impact lifted Elias entirely off his feet. He crashed into the control console, ribs snapping like dry twigs under the force. Before he could even register the agonizing pain, Briggs was on him. The enforcer hauled Elias up by the collar of his hazard suit and drove a steel-plated knee into his abdomen. Elias coughed violently, a spray of crimson painting the inside of his visor. "Treaty?" Smith laughed, crouching down beside Elias's broken body. He grabbed Elias by the hair, wrenching his head back. "There are no treaties in the dirt, little man. There is only power. And you don't have any." They beat him with a casual, terrifying efficiency. They didn't try to kill him quickly. They treated him like a stress relief toy, breaking his left arm, fracturing his collarbone, and rupturing his suit's primary oxygen line. "Throw him in the transport," Smith ordered, wiping a speck of human blood off his knuckles. "Dump him out in the cinder basin. Let the acid storms finish him off. If the baseline wants to keep his dirt so badly, he can die in it." They dragged Elias's semi-conscious body to a cargo skiff. Hours later, he was kicked out of the hovering vehicle, tumbling down a steep, jagged ravine of black glass and toxic ash. He landed hard, sliding to a halt in the pitch black of the cinder basin, 40 miles from the nearest outpost. As the hum of the skiff faded into the upper atmosphere, Elias lay in the dust, his vision swimming. The warning alarms in his helmet shrieked. "Warning, primary oxygen compromised. Estimated life support, 14 minutes. Every breath was a fire in his lungs. His left arm was useless. His body was systematically failing. A normal man would have closed his eyes and let the freezing dark take him. A baseline was supposed to die. But as Elias stared up at the indifferent, starlit sky of Aegis Prime, the fear inside him burned away, leaving behind something cold, dense, and terrifyingly sharp. 42 years of taking orders, 42 years of being pushed around, beaten down, and treated like a rounding error. He reached up with his trembling right hand, blindly feeling for the ruptured valve on his suit. He didn't have a patch kit, but he had a roll of industrial therm tape and a lighter in his utility belt. He ripped a piece of tape with his teeth, slapped it over the hiss of escaping air, and held his lighter to the edge, melting the adhesive directly into the suit's fabric. The heat scorched his shoulder through the padding, but the hissing stopped. Life support stabilized. Reserve oxygen, 4 hours. Elias slowly pushed himself up to his knees. He spat a mouthful of blood onto the black ash. He wasn't dead, and the Syndicate had just made the gravest mistake an apex predator could make. They failed to secure the kill. They failed to secure the kill. They failed to secure the kill. The Cinder Basin was a graveyard of abandoned corporate ambitions. Decades ago, massive automated terraforming engines had been dropped here, only to fail against the planet's relentless tectonic shifts. Now, it was a labyrinth of rusted metal husks, deep thermal vents, and jagged obsidian canyons. Elias dragged himself into the shell of a massive, overturned atmospheric processor. It offered shelter from the biting acid winds. He spent the first 12 hours simply surviving. Using a salvaged piece of copper tubing and a battery cell from his headlamp, he cauterized a deep laceration on his thigh. He splinted his broken arm using a sheared piece of fiberglass hull and tightened it with zip ties until he nearly blacked out from the pain. He was fueled by a singular, consuming thought. They took my life. I am going to take theirs. Back at the outpost, Overseer Smith sat in his command center, reviewing the day's profits. He glanced at the biometric tracking grid on his secondary monitor. Every miner had a biochip embedded in their spine corporate policy for recovering bodies. Smith frowned. The blinking green dot representing Elias Stanton was still active in the Cinder Basin. "Briggs," Smith called out, "the baseline is still breathing. Must have patched his suit. I want him zeroed." "It's bad for morale. If the others find out a human survived a basin drop," Briggs grunted. "I'll take a squad. We'll bring his head back for the mess hall." Briggs assembled a 4-man hunting party. He brought Dawson, their best tracker, a lean, cruel man with enhanced ocular implants, and 2 heavy muscle enforcers, Hayes and Carter. They geared up with thermal optic rifles, heavy kinetic plating, and an arrogant swagger. To them, this wasn't a military operation. It was a pest control assignment. They took a heavy rover out to the basin, tracking the biosignal to the edge of the terraformer graveyard. "Signal is stationary," Dawson said, tapping the side of his glowing blue eye. "He's holed up in one of the old processor stacks, probably curled up in a corner, waiting to freeze." "Spread out," Briggs ordered, racking the bolt of his rifle. "First one to put a hole in him gets his ration tokens for the month." The 4 hunters fanned out, their heavy boots crunching loudly on the black glass. They didn't bother using stealth. Why would they? They were gods walking among insects. Inside the rusted hull, Elias watched them through a cracked piece of mirrored glass he'd rigged to act as a periscope. He saw their weapons. He saw their armor. He knew a direct confrontation was suicide. But Elias was an engineer. He understood pressure. He understood leverage. And he understood the explosive properties of the industrial chemicals left behind in the ruins. He had spent the last 8 hours working. Not resting, working. Carter, one of the heavy enforcers, pushed his way through a narrow gap between 2 rusted exhaust pipes. He kept his rifle lowered, scanning the shadows lazily. He didn't notice the incredibly thin wire of thermal lace strung at ankle height. As Carter's boot snapped the wire, a mechanical click echoed in the tight space. Elias had rigged the wire to the release valve of a highly pressurized, ancient coolant tank he had found buried in the debris, but he had bypassed the regulators. The sudden release didn't just vent the gas. It ruptured the tank's structural integrity. The explosion wasn't fiery, it was concussive and freezing. A shockwave of liquid nitrogen and shrapnel tore through the narrow gap. Carter didn't even have time to scream. The freezing blast flash froze his armor, making it brittle as glass, before a jagged piece of the tank's hull severed him cleanly in half. The booming echo rattled the canyon. Briggs whipped around, raising his rifle. "Carter! Report!" Static hissed over the comms. "Dawson, get a visual on Carter," Briggs yelled, a flicker of genuine annoyance crossing his face. Dawson sprinted toward the sound of the blast, rounding a massive gear shaft. He skidded to a halt, his cybernetic eye zooming in on the grotesque, frozen remains of his squadmate. "Boss, Carter is down. He hit a booby trap, a rigged pressure tank." "A trap?" Hayes sneered over the radio. "The baseline can barely walk. How the hell did he rig a high-pressure tank?" "Keep moving," Briggs growled, his pride stung. "He just got lucky. He's bleeding out, throwing Hail Marys. Find him and end this." But the atmosphere had shifted. The hunters were suddenly holding their rifles a little tighter. They began checking their corners. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a creeping, unfamiliar sensation. Elias was already moving. He was a ghost in the shadows, navigating the labyrinth of pipes and debris he had spent hours memorizing. He knew where the floorboards were weak. He knew where the toxic geysers vented. He tracked Hayes, who was moving along an elevated catwalk that hung precariously over a deep, glowing green thermal vent. Hayes was sweating, his eyes darting at every shadow. Elias climbed a vertical support beam with agonizing slowness, his broken arm bound tightly to his chest, relying entirely on his legs and his right arm. He reached a junction box just above Hayes's position. He waited until the heavy enforcer was exactly halfway across the rusted catwalk. Elias didn't use an explosive this time. He used simple physics. He unlatched a massive, 2-ton industrial counterweight that had been suspended by a rusted crane cable. He had spent an hour sawing through 80% of the locking pin with a salvaged diamond-edge drill bit. Now, all it took was a sharp strike from a heavy wrench to shatter the remaining pin. The counterweight plummeted. It didn't hit Hayes. It hit the center of the catwalk right in front of him. The sheer kinetic force snapped the ancient steel supports like matchsticks. Hayes screamed as the catwalk inverted. He dropped his rifle, clawing frantically at the smooth metal grating as he slid downward. "Help! Briggs! Pull me up!" Briggs and Dawson rushed toward the catwalk, but they were too late. They watched in horror as Hayes lost his grip, plummeting 60 feet down into the boiling, acidic thermal vent. A geyser of toxic steam erupted, carrying the brief, agonizing sound of his armor dissolving. Silence descended on the ruins, heavy and suffocating. 2 men down, 0 shots fired by the target. "Dawson," Briggs said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Where is the biosignal? Give me a goddamn location." Dawson tapped his wrist comp frantically. It's bouncing, boss." He stripped the biochip. He must have dug it out of his own spine. "I'm picking up the signal, but it's attached to a local fauna rat running in circles." Briggs felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his thick neck. Humans couldn't do that. A baseline couldn't perform self-surgery, dig a chip out of their own spinal column without anesthetics, and keep moving. They went into shock. They died. "This isn't a baseline," Dawson whispered, his enhanced eye wide with sudden terror, darting around the rusted shadows. "Briggs, we're being hunted." High above them, perched in the darkness of an exhaust manifold, Elias watched the remaining 2 men panic. His face was pale, smeared with black ash and dried blood. His back burned with the raw, gaping wound where he had dug the tracker out using a heated piece of wire. He was in agony, but his mind was crystal clear. He keyed a stolen comlink he had stripped off Carter's frozen corpse. Down below, Briggs's earpiece crackled to life. Instead of a weeping, broken man, the voice that came through the channel was low, calm, and terrifyingly cold. 2 down, Briggs, Elias's voice echoed in the syndicate enforcer's ear. "Tell Smith his 30% tax just went up. I'm taking everything." Briggs fired wildly into the darkness, the thermal optic bolts shattering against empty rust. The predator had become the prey, and the long, bloody night had only just begun. Fear is a highly corrosive element. It eats through discipline, dissolves hierarchy, and rusts the ironclad certainty of superiority. For Briggs and Dawson, the creeping realization that they were no longer the apex predators on Aegis Prime was entirely paralyzing. They were high-G syndicate muscle, bred to intimidate and crush. They were not built to fight a shadow that bled but refused to die. "Form up, back to back," Briggs roared, his voice cracking as the echo of Elias's threat bounced off the rusted canyon walls of the cinder basin. He swung his heavy thermal optic rifle at every shifting shadow, the weapon's targeting laser painting the jagged debris in erratic red lines. Dawson was hyperventilating, his cybernetic eye whirred, cycling frantically through infrared, ultraviolet, and thermal spectrums. "I can't lock him, boss. The ambient heat from the vents is washing out the thermals. He's cold." "Why is he cold?" Up in the rusted scaffolding, Elias was wrapped in a thermal reflective blanket he had stripped from the primary emergency kit of a crashed surveyor drone. It masked his body heat, blending him perfectly into the ambient temperature of the frozen metal. He gritted his teeth, fighting a wave of nausea. The pain in his broken arm was a constant, blinding white noise in his skull. The self-inflicted wound on his back, where he had carved out his own biochip, throbbed with a sickening rhythm. He was running on adrenaline, spite, and the cold, mechanical logic of an engineer. Elias analyzed the 2 men below. Dawson was the immediate threat. That ocular implant gave him an edge that Elias couldn't physically match. But Elias understood hardware. He understood that syndicate augments were mass-produced, poorly shielded, and highly susceptible to electromagnetic interference. He didn't need a military-grade EMP to blind Dawson. He just needed a heavy-duty power surge. Elias crept along the gantry, his boots making no sound against the steel. He reached a derelict junction box, a massive, heavy-duty power relay, painted in the faded, chipped yellow of an ancient Caterpillar industrial terraformer. It was a relic from Earth's first expansion waves, built a century ago and renowned for being virtually indestructible. The capacitor banks inside were still holding a latent, highly unstable charge from the planet's atmospheric static. Elias pulled a pair of insulated wire cutters from his belt. He didn't disable the safety limiters. He inverted them. He took a heavy spool of copper grounding wire, tied one end to the massive capacitor bank, and threw the heavy spool down into the dark. The spool unraveled silently, dropping 50 feet and landing with a soft metallic clank right into a puddle of conductive, highly acidic runoff, pooling just 3 feet from Dawson's boots. Dawson whipped around, his optic implant zooming in on the splash. Movement! By the puddle! Light it up! Briggs screamed, raising his rifle. Elias slammed his fist onto the primary discharge breaker of the Caterpillar relay. A massive, crackling arc of blue electricity shot down the copper wire. It didn't just hit the puddle. It turned the highly mineralized acidic runoff into a localized lightning storm. The current violently grounded out, sending a massive electromagnetic spike radiating outward. Dawson screamed. The unshielded cybernetic eye in his skull caught the EMP wave and catastrophically overloaded. Sparks showered from his socket as the microprocessors fused. The sudden, agonizing neural feedback dropped him to his knees, his hands clawing at his face. My eye! It's burning! I'm blind! Briggs flinched, shielding his face from the shower of sparks. In his panic, he made the ultimate mistake. He looked down at his wounded comrade instead of up at the threat. Elias dropped from the scaffolding, using his good arm to control his descent down a hanging chain. He landed softly on a metal shipping container directly behind Briggs. He didn't have a rifle. He didn't have heavy kinetic plating, but he had a modified Hilti DX 900 powder-actuated fastening tool. A heavy industrial nail gun designed to drive 6-inch titanium rivets through solid ferro-concrete. He had bypassed the contact safety mechanism hours ago. Briggs spun around at the sound of Elias's boots hitting the metal roof of the container, raising his rifle. Elias fired. The deafening crack of the industrial powder charge echoed like a cannon shot. The 6-inch titanium rivet tore through the air and embedded itself dead center in the mechanism of Briggs's thermal optic rifle, shattering the plasma chamber and fusing the bolt to the casing. The weapon sparked violently, dead in Briggs's hands. Before the brute could drop the useless gun, Elias fired twice more in rapid succession. The second rivet punched cleanly through Briggs's heavy combat boot, pinning his right foot securely to the grated steel floor. The third rivet caught Briggs in the meat of his right shoulder, pinning him against a rusted support pillar. Briggs bellowed in pain, dropping the ruined rifle. He tugged frantically at his pinned leg, but the titanium rivet held fast. He was a giant, trapped by a carpenter's tool. Elias climbed down from the container and walked slowly into the dim light. He looked like a nightmare, his hazard suit scorched, his face gaunt and covered in dried blood, his left arm tightly strapped to his chest. Yet, his eyes were calm. It was a cold, terrifying serenity that made Briggs stop struggling. Dawson, Briggs gasped, looking at his blinded tracker, who was curled in a fetal position, sobbing. Kill him! He's right here! Dawson just moaned, clutching his smoking eye socket. Elias stood a few feet from the massive syndicate enforcer. He reached into his utility belt, pulled out Briggs's dropped comlink, and crushed it under his boot. Then, he picked up the intact, high-range radio unit from Dawson's belt. You're a dead man, Stanton, Briggs spat, blood trickling from his lips. You hear me? Smith will send a whole battalion out here. You're just meat. A battalion costs money, Briggs, Elias said softly, his voice raspy from the dry, toxic air. And Smith is a businessman. He won't spend credits on a ghost in a junkyard. Elias turned a valve on a nearby auxiliary air tank, aiming the nozzle at Briggs. I'm going to leave you here. The acid storms roll in at dusk. If you can rip your foot through the rivet before then, you might make it back to the rover. But you won't. Because you're not built to endure. You're only built to bully. Elias turned his back on the hulking enforcer and began to walk away into the shadows of the basin. Stanton, Briggs roared, raw terror finally bleeding into his voice. You can't do this. We are the syndicate. Elias didn't look back. Not anymore. Overseer Smith poured himself a glass of distilled amber agave, leaning back in his leather-bound chair within the heavily fortified control room of Outpost Delta. The outpost was a sprawling fortress of permacrete and steel, situated on a high mesa overlooking the Sector 4 mining grid. Outside, the perimeter was lined with automated heavy cal turret emplacements and patrolled by 24 armed guards. It had been 8 hours since Briggs's hunting party went dark in the Cinder Basin. Smith wasn't an idiot. He knew a baseline human hadn't taken out his best enforcers in a straight fight. Stanton must have had help. A rival corporate hit squad, perhaps, or a group of mercenary scavengers who stumbled upon the bleeding miner and saw an opportunity to ambush syndicate forces. Sir, the comms officer, a pale, nervous technician named Vance, called out from his terminal. Wait. Self-correction. The prompt explicitly forbade the name Vance. Let's change that to Galloway. Thanks for watching, and make subscribed to Subscribed-in. The prompt explicitly forbade the name. Sir, the comms officer, a pale, nervous technician named Galloway, called out from his terminal. I'm receiving a transmission on the encrypted command channel. Audio only. Smith frowned, setting his glass down. Put it on speakers. Trace the origin. Static hissed through the room, followed by the heavy, rhythmic sound of breathing. Smith. A cold, raspy voice echoed from the speakers. The overseer's blood ran cold. It was Stanton, the baseline. Stanton, Smith replied, leaning into the microphone, masking his unease with arrogance. I don't know who you hired out there in the dirt, but you've made a fatal error. I'm locking down the sector. I'll burn the entire basin from orbit if I have to. You didn't look closely enough at my yield, Smith. Elias's voice replied smoothly over the crackling comms. You saw a massive crate of hyperlithium and got greedy. You didn't realize it was unstable isotope 238. It requires constant thermal regulation. Otherwise, the microscopic crystalline lattice begins to vibrate. Smith froze. He looked up at Galloway. Where did they store his confiscated crate? Galloway typed frantically, his face draining of color. Sir, standard procedure. They locked it in the primary subterranean vault, directly beneath the main atmospheric life support generators. Stanton, you bluffing piece of... I'm not in the basin anymore, Smith, Elias interrupted. A deafening, earth-shattering explosion rocked Outpost Delta. The entire permacrete structure groaned as the floor violently bucked upward. The lights flickered, died, and were instantly replaced by the eerie, pulsing red glow of emergency backup power. Alarms began to shriek, a cacophony of sirens that drowned out the frantic shouting of the guards in the corridors. Damage report, Smith bellowed, gripping the edge of his console to stay upright. Primary vault breached, Galloway yelled over the sirens. The hyperlithium detonated. It took out the lower sublevels. Sir, the atmospheric generators are offline. The filtration systems are dead. Smith's eyes widened in horror. Aegis Prime's atmosphere was a lethal soup of sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide. The outpost relied on massive scrubbers to constantly pump breathable air into the sealed base. Without them, the toxic exterior atmosphere would slowly seep in. Seal the blast doors. Switch to reserve oxygen tanks, Smith ordered, pulling a heavy plasma pistol from his holster. Sir, the reserve tanks. They're venting. Galloway panicked, staring at his monitor. Someone manually opened the external purge valves. We have maybe 20 minutes of breathable air left in the command center. Smith gritted his teeth. It wasn't a mercenary squad. It was just Stanton. The baseline had crawled out of the basin, bypassed a mile of automated perimeter defenses, and systematically dismantled an impenetrable fortress from the outside in. Elias hadn't fought the guards. He had used the environment against them. Outside the command center, chaos reigned. The heavy syndicate guards, bred for high gravity and dense muscle mass, had astronomical oxygen requirements. As the air thinned and the sulfur seeped into the corridors, they began to choke. Panic set in. Brutes who could lift a ton of dead weight were collapsing to their knees, gasping for breath, tearing at their collars. Through the thick, hazy corridors, Elias walked. He had patched his hazard suit with layers of hardened resin and industrial tape. He wore his heavy breathing mask, drawing deep, steady breaths of his carefully rationed oxygen supply. In his right hand, he held the modified Hilti powder-actuated gun. In his belt, He carried an array of high-explosive mining charges. He was no longer a victim. He was a force of nature, an engineer who had found the structural weak point of a corrupt empire and was methodically applying pressure. Two guards stumbled out of the armory, coughing violently, their eyes streaming with tears from the sulfur. They spotted Elias through the red-lit smoke and weakly raised their weapons. Elias didn't even break his stride. He tossed a modified mining flare at their feet. The flare ignited, blinding them with a brilliant 10,000 candle power flash. As they recoiled, blinded and choking, Elias walked past them, casually ripping the primary power cells from their dropped rifles so they couldn't fire at his back. He didn't need to kill them. The atmosphere would do the math for him. He reached the heavy titanium blast doors of the command center. They were magnetically sealed, designed to withstand a direct artillery strike. Inside, Smith watched the security feed on Galloway's monitor. He saw the battered, bloodied human standing in front of the unyielding doors. Smith let out a dark, breathless laugh. He's trapped. He can't get in. We wait him out. His suit oxygen will run dry eventually. On the monitor, Elias didn't try to force the door. He didn't place explosives on the thick titanium. Instead, he reached up to the ceiling panel, just above the door frame. He pulled down the heavy bundles of fiber optic cables that connected the command center's magnetic locks to the base's mainframe. "What is he doing?" Galloway whispered. Elias stripped the casing off the primary power line. He then unspooled a thick length of conductive wire, attaching one end to the live power line and the other to the heavy steel frame of the blast door itself. He was turning the door into a massive electromagnet, reversing its polarity. Elias stepped back, raised his Hilti gun, and fired a titanium rivet directly into the control box, creating a massive, uncontrolled short circuit. The resulting surge of raw electricity was catastrophic. The magnetic locks screamed as the polarity violently inverted. The sheer magnetic repulsion tore the heavy titanium bolts right out of their permacrete housings. The massive doors didn't just open. They violently blew outward, crashing to the floor with a sound like a thunderclap. The toxic, sulfur-thick air from the corridor flooded into the command center immediately. Galloway fell back, coughing violently as the stinging gas hit his lungs. Smith stood his ground, raising his plasma pistol, his massive chest heaving as he struggled to process the thin air. Elias stepped through the smoke, the red emergency lights casting long, terrifying shadows across his scorched hazard suit. He looked at Smith, the towering overseer who had beaten him, broken him, and left him for dead just a day ago. Smith aimed his pistol squarely at Elias's chest. His hand was shaking. "You're a dead man." Baseline. Elias didn't flinch. He slowly raised his right hand, holding a small, blinking detonator switch. "I mined a lot of hyperlithium, Smith," Elias said, his voice muffled but terrifyingly clear through his respirator mask. "I put a charge under the vault, but I also wired the secondary yield directly to the outpost's central plasma manifold. If my thumb slips off this dead man's switch, the entire mesa turns into a crater." Smith froze. He looked at the detonator, then up at the cold, calculating eyes behind the cracked visor. The syndicate boss realized, with absolute, horrifying certainty, that the man standing before him wasn't bluffing. Elias Stanton had already died in the cinder basin. The thing that came back didn't care about survival anymore. It only cared about the equation, and the equation demanded balance. "What do you want?" Smith rasped, coughing up a spatter of blood as the sulfur ravaged his lungs. Elias lowered his Hilti gun. Everything. The air in the command center was a thick, yellow soup of corrosive gases. Galloway was slumped over his console, unconscious or dead, his lungs unable to process the atmospheric poison. Smith, however, was a high-G specimen. His augmented biology fought the toxins with a frantic, desperate strength. He stood swaying, his plasma pistol leveled at Elias's chest. But the barrel was heavy, dipping as his motor functions began to fail. You can't rule a crater." Smith wheezed, the words tearing at his throat. Elias stepped closer, the heavy rhythmic hiss of his respirator the only sound in the room. I'm not a ruler, Smith. I'm an engineer. When a structure is compromised beyond repair, you don't try to patch it. You perform a controlled demolition. Elias reached out with his right hand and calmly pushed the barrel of Smith's pistol aside. The overseer was too weak to resist. The gun clattered to the floor. Elias then reached into the pocket of his scorched suit and pulled out a small encrypted data drive. This drive contains the full logs of the syndicate's illegal lithium skimming, the unauthorized executions of Earthborn miners, and the bypassed safety protocols that led to the collapse of Sector 3 last year. Elias said, I've been collecting this for 3 years, waiting for a reason to use it. You gave me that reason in the basin. Smith's eyes went wide. The Core World Labor Board. They'll execute me. 1-1. No, Elias corrected him, his voice devoid of emotion. They'll execute the syndicate's charter. They'll seize every asset on Aegis Prime. The miners will be compensated. The high-G enforcers will be de-augmented and deported. And you're going to help me upload this to the orbital relay. I won't, Smith growled, though it was more of a wet gurgle. Elias tightened his grip on the detonator. The plasma manifold is currently vibrating at 60 Hz, Smith. At 70, the containment field collapses. If you don't bypass the relay's encryption right now, we both vaporize. I've already made my peace with the dirt. Have you? Smith looked at the blinking red light on the detonator, then at the dying man in the hazard suit. He saw no hesitation in Elias's eyes. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a physical law. Smith stumbled toward the primary uplink terminal, his massive fingers trembling as he punched in the command overrides. Data. Uploading. Smith gasped. On the main screen, a progress bar flickered to life. 10%, 40%, 85%. Upload. Complete. Transmission. Broadcast to Core. World Sector Command. The moment the confirmation cleared, the weight of the last 48 hours seemed to hit Elias all at once. He slumped against a heavy equipment rack, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. The adrenaline that had carried him across 40 miles of acid-scorched wasteland was finally evaporating. It's done, Elias whispered. Smith collapsed into his chair, clutching his chest. You destroyed it all. You built it on the backs of men you thought were too small to matter, Elias replied. You forgot that a single loose bolt can bring down a starship. Suddenly, the base's internal sensors shrieked a new warning. A high-altitude thermal signature was descending rapidly toward Outpost Delta. The orbital guard. Smith laughed breathlessly. They saw the explosion. And they're coming to restore order. No, Elias said, looking at the screen. That's not an orbital guard shuttle. That's an automated medical evac. I triggered it when I breached the vault. Elias turned and began to limp toward the shattered blast doors. Where are you going? Smith called out, his voice fading. To get my 30%, Elias said. He navigated the smoke-filled corridors, passing the fallen shapes of enforcers who had once mocked him. He reached the hangar bay just as the automated evac drone touched down, its sterile white hull a jarring contrast to the black soot of the base. Elias climbed into the pressurized cabin. He didn't look back at the fortress he had dismantled. He didn't look back at the man who had tried to break him. He sat in the pilot's seat, let the oxygen mask drop over his face, and took the first clean breath he had tasted in years. As the drone lifted off, banking away from the mesa, Elias looked down at the mining grid. Below him, the other miners, men and women like Liam O'Shea and Sarah Jenkins, baselines who had lived in fear for a decade, were emerging from their shelters. Looking up at the sky, the syndicate's flags were being torn down. The automated turrets were powered off. Elias Stanton, the man they called Fragile Prey, had rewritten the ecology of a planet. He had proven that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy isn't a predator with genetic enhancements or heavy plating. It is a human with a wrench, a plan, and nothing left to lose. He leaned his head back against the cold plastic of the seat and closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, the debt was paid in full. Elias didn't just survive, he redefined the cost of arrogance. On Aegis Prime, they no longer tell stories of syndicate might or high-G dominance. They tell the legend of the engineer. It serves as a warning to every empire that thinks it can crush the baseline. We are built to endure, to adapt, and when pushed too far, to dismantle the world around us, until justice is the only thing left standing. Would you like me to generate a blueprint or visual representation of the improvised traps Elias used to turn the tide?